It's easier to market an EU investment fund in the UK than a domestic one. Wayne, when people have an investment proposition that they want to bring to the world, they often think about setting up an investment fund. And we find that there's a lot of focus on the product itself, but actually less focus on the regulatory puzzle that needs to be solved. And let's talk about some of those elements and how the regulatory piece features in setting up and launching a new investment fund.
Yeah, so right from the off, the first thing you've got to work out is what is it your fund's going to do, and then the second bit is who are you going to sell that fund to. And those are the very basic fundamental parts of page 1 of your regulatory application, aren't they? So what's the regulatory structure? What's the investment objective? Mm-hmm. What's the policy? And so on. And these, I think, are often seen as quite a straightforward, reasonably simple bit to get started with, but actually are far more complicated, aren't they? As I imagine that you've come across when you've designed some funds in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this idea that, well, hey, we've got a great track record, we've got great performance, we've got an investment proposition that, is going to be attractive in the market, isn't it? So let's just fit that into a structure and submit an application. And often people kind of don't get beyond thinking about page 1 and thinking about all of the different pieces that need to go into a regulatory application. And more importantly, the scrutiny that a regulator like the FCA is going to impose when they're looking through the fund and the way in which that's structured, all of the service providers. So it's a really important decision, and it's really critical, because if you make the wrong call, you'll either get an application rejected or you're going to extend the period of time that it's going to take to launch the product and then maybe miss the market opportunity.
Yeah, one of the big sort of problems that I think portfolio managers have with this, that's probably getting a bit better, but if you're in particular an EU-based fund manager coming into the UK, you're going to find this, is that the temptation is to give yourself the broadest possible investment objective and strategy remit, I guess, so that you're not too constrained. Absolutely. But then as soon as you put that in under the nose of someone like the FCA, and increasingly the EU, to be fair, then you're going to hit a bit of a problem there, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think regulators are looking for the investment objectives to be clearly described, but really they're looking to enable a retail investor to understand what the product is doing, but also to be able to compare that product against others as well. So if you're looking for an investment in a particular sector or particular theme, it's being clear on how does this fund work, what does this fund invest in, what's its investment thesis, compared to, let's say, the other 10 funds that are in that particular sector, and then allowing an investor or their advisor to determine which is the most appropriate product.
What that starts to do then is bring you into something that's probably a little more complex, but certainly a lot less familiar to portfolio managers, which is what's the right structure from a regulatory perspective for a fund. So suddenly now you're faced with USITS, AIF in the UK, you've got non-USITS and so on. What are the kind of options there that people have, and what impact does that have on the fund from an investment objective point of view, but then I guess throughout the entire rest of the fund's setup? And
there are probably 2 buckets that I would put the answer to that question into. Firstly, who is the target market for the fund? And fairly clearly that's going to either be retail or it's not going to be retail. But digging into that, what do we mean by retail? Do we mean mass market retail? Do we mean more sophisticated retail investors? Or are we just targeting kind of professionals, high net worth individuals, etc.? So that investor type, if you like, that target market is one of the 2 buckets that you need to think about in making the decision as to which structure you're looking for. The other bucket is really the investment proposition. And here we're into, the assets that we're thinking about investing in. Are we investing in main market assets like equities or bonds? Are we interested in real estate or infrastructure or other private credit, for example, or private equity? And that's the other consideration that we need to think about in determining which fund structure. And I'm sure we're going to unpick some of those acronyms you just mentioned a moment ago. So it's the investor piece, but also the investment piece that you need to think about.
Yeah. So I guess most people are going to be familiar with USITS. So let's start with that. So the pros and cons of USITS, what does it allow you to do? But also, having that wider access and that familiarity brings with it, I guess, more restrictions than you've got with other fund structures.
Absolutely. So UCITS, undertakings for collective investment in transferable securities, to give it its full name. This is the EU created investment fund framework, really for retail focused investment funds. With UCITS can be distributed to professional funds. Post Brexit, we have the UK UCITS regime, and then we have the EU regime as well. One of the main benefits, I guess, of that structure is it's well understood and well known by retail investors and also advisors. We have the added benefit of being able to, in the EU passport, so being able to market that fund more broadly. But there are some constraints with that structure. And the main constraints with UCITS are on the investment side. So really just the focus on, if you like, transferable securities, as we call them. But what we mean by that is kind of main market securities like stocks and shares or bonds, but not including assets like real estate. So we couldn't set up a real estate fund in a UCITS structure, for example. So it's really optimal from a distribution and an understanding perspective, but also considerations on the investment side in, what can we do? And it's not just what can we invest in, it's how we can invest as well. Because we have lots of limits in the UCITS structure on the concentration and the diversification requirements of the portfolio. So lots of considerations on the investment side.
And just to focus on UCITS a little bit more, you mentioned there about the post-Brexit position for EU and UK cross-border distribution. We still have the term UCITS in the UK that everyone's still using as if it were never changed, but of course it is different because, as you say, it's UK UCITS now. EU UCITS are still just UCITS. We talk to a lot of people who are either UK based and just distributing throughout the UK. We talk to UK based who want to distribute into Europe, and we talk to even more who are European and want to distribute into the UK. So what does that sort of UCITS structure look like from a distribution, cross-border distribution perspective now, post-Brexit?
Yeah, absolutely. And the picture's a lot more complicated. Previously, you could have a UCITS anywhere in the EU. Of course, before Brexit, that meant that you could then sell that fund very easily into the UK. Now we have a different way in which you sell into the UK from the EU and then from the UK going the other way. So for an EU UCITS, so it's set up in a fund centre like Dublin or Luxembourg, that has the ability to distribute under the marketing passport across the EU, so across the 27 member states. That's relatively unchanged post-Brexit and a very well understood structure. The difference is distributing that EU UCITS fund in the UK. And here we have the Overseas Funds Regime, or the OFR, which is the framework that the UK and the Treasury and the FCA have introduced, which requires the EU UCITS fund, so a Dublin or Luxembourg fund, to effectively jump through a few more hoops, to put it simply, to be able to distribute that product in the UK. And one of those hoops is getting the recognition under the Overseas Funds Regime from the FCA with various requirements that need to be met.
Yeah. And one interesting outcome, I think, from the OFR regime is that if you are an EU UCITS manager, you've got an established EU UCITS fund, and you want to distribute that into the UK, previously you were under the temporary permissions regime. So between Brexit and the OFR coming in, it was temporary permissions regime. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to pay anything. You were just already here. You carried on marketing and distributing. Everyone was happy. Then OFR came along, and now you've got to pay the regulator. You're probably going to pay a law firm or a consultant to do some of your scheme docs. You may have to pay someone like Xero, a Section 21 approver, to do your marketing. So there's money to be paid now to carry on doing what was previously free. However, to those people that are in the UK already, they will probably see, I think, it being easier to bring an EU UCITS to market in the UK and cheaper than it is to set one up in the UK from scratch.
Yeah, and that's an interesting policy outcome, if we want to call it that. I want to pick up on one of the points you mentioned there and then add an additional point which is relevant to what you've just said. One of the additional hoops that you need to jump through as an EU UCITS that wants to distribute in the UK under the overseas funds regime is to have a financial promotion approver, so a Section 21 approver like Zero, if you do not have basically a group company that is in the UK that's authorised by the FCA. And that's an additional sort of marketing cost, if you want to call it that, but an additional regulatory hoop that you need to jump through. Probably one of the most pronounced differences between distributing an EU UCITS into the UK and setting up a UK UCITS, I think, is probably the value assessment requirement. So we have in the EU this concept of undue costs, as it's called, which is something that ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority, so the pan-EU regulatory authority, has done a lot of work on. And undue costs are really trying to, determine the costs that shouldn't be charged under fairness to investors in a UCITS. The UK has the value assessment requirement. That's been a requirement for UK retail funds for several years now, and there are several criteria that you need to assess the value of your fund against and produce a report that you update on an annual basis for that. That is an additional requirement that a UK UCITS will need to meet, but an EU UCITS won't need to comply with that value assessment requirement. So there is a difference there between the two. But Wayne, what's the thought process then as to why would you set up an EU UCITS versus a UK UCITS? What's the determining factor from a distribution point of view that's going to drive that decision?
I think if you're already in the UK and your customer base or your potential customer base, your target market is in the UK, then that's a reasonably straightforward decision, right? So you're going to want to be a UK business. And that's also because the decision makers in that investment process, the advisors, wealth managers, even the D2C retail platforms that you want to list on, are going to expect to see that UK base for a fund. However, we deal with a lot of global portfolio managers. So global might mean European, we've talked about. It also includes a lot of portfolio managers in the US. We've got Singapore, we've got Hong Kong. There's global managers out there that want to come into Europe, who used to see Europe as one place, including the UK. Now we have to remind them that they're two separate jurisdictions. Yeah. So if you've got global investor base, you're not based in the UK, you want to get distribution in a number of different jurisdictions, the most common route is to go either Dublin or Luxembourg, EU UCITS products, and then passport into the UK via the offshore funds regime. That's the most cost-effective way of doing that.
Okay, and so are we then thinking that a UK UCITS, the decision to set up a UK UCITS, is because we're viewing that distribution proposition more as a domestic UK market proposition? Because I guess if we are distributing a UK UCITS in the EU, so let's say we have a UK UCITS we want to sell into France, France, the French regulator, the AMF, would consider that to be effectively an alternative investment fund, a retail alternative investment fund, even though it's a UCITS, because it's coming now from outside of the EU, from a third country like the UK, sort of into France. So it's almost a competitive disadvantage from a regulatory point of view to be distributing UK UCITS into the EU, and so that's an important sort of decision point, I think, that we often see maybe isn't thought about early enough in the process. So what is our kind of target market, and thinking about that. That's one piece of the regulatory kind of puzzle. We talk quite a lot about UCITS. I guess we should talk about kind of everything else. So just non-UCITS or alternative investment funds, as we sometimes think about them. So why would you set up an alternative investment fund? Why would you go the non-UCITS route then, rather than the UCITS route?
Essentially, because what you want to invest in, so your portfolio mandate, what you're good at, where your target market want to gain investment exposure, just doesn't fit within the restrictions of a UCITS structure. So like you said at the start, UCITS structures are more restrictive than non-UCITS structures. So you're limited in what you can invest in. You're limited in the proportion of investments that you can put into any particular asset or asset class. So the spread of risk can be much narrower than it needs to be. for a UCITS product.
Yep.
But of course, with that, then comes some other restrictions on who you can sell to and how you get to those people.
Yeah. And when we think about kind of the non-UCITS bucket, if you like, so we'll just call these alternative investment funds, typically regulated in the EU historically under the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, and that's been revised now. We now have a second version of that. Within that alternative investment fund bucket, we often find in different jurisdictions that there will be a retail version of an alternative investment fund and then a sort of non-retail version. So in the UK, and this is just so many acronyms here,
Yeah.
but we have what we call a non-UCITS retail scheme, a NURS, an NURS, if we want to put the acronym around, which is a type of alternative investment fund. We see something similar, for example, in Ireland, we have the Retail Investor, AIF, Retail Investor Alternative Investment Fund. Same kind of idea that we have. It's an alternative investment fund, but the local regulator, the local jurisdiction has created a kind of retail version, of that. So why would we use some like a retail version of that alternative investment fund rather than, let's say, a professional version? Like what's the decision point there for us? What's the determination?
So bluntly, the market's bigger, so you can get more assets. That's basically why you would be doing that. So if you go more professional,
okay,
so more alternative. So non-UCITS is kind of one degree of alternative away from a full UCITS, right? And it's retail accessible to a degree. Then what you start to find there is that you can get it listed on more retail-facing platforms, for example.
Okay.
Because they're less nervous about what it's going to do, because it has still got more restrictions than a fully professional, fully alternative fund, and there's less for them to do when they're qualifying investor types and doing appropriateness and suitability tests and so on.
Okay.
What it also brings then is into scope are some more of the wrap products that it can fit into. So some of them will be able to be invested in through an ISA. Some will be accessible via a SIP, and that depends on how retail it is versus how very professional it is. So your market is grown a lot wider on that.
And just to, again, put some names around this and some acronyms. So in the UK, we mentioned already the non-UCITS retail scheme. So this is a type of alternative investment fund designed really for retail investors. There's also, for example, the qualified investor scheme, the quiz, as we call it, which is the kind of professional version of the alternative investment fund. We're going to get on and talk in a moment about how regulators think about sort of fund applications. But we talked a lot about these kind of structuring, questions and determining what kind of which is the structure. Is it fair to say that if we put an application together, we go through the regulations and the rules, and we're kind of quite happy that everything's kind of compliant. We think our investment proposition is amazing, of course, because we wouldn't be creating a fund, and bringing that to the wider world. Is it kind of reasonable to assume then, it's compliant? We're going to submit that to someone like a regulator like the FCA, and we're kind of all good. They're just going to go through, checking the boxes. This is all compliant. We're all good, and we can get it authorised.
I think the key term you use there that means the answer is no is checking the boxes.
Okay.
So what no regulator's doing is just checking the boxes or ticking the boxes. It's a much more in-depth piece of review and scrutiny than that. So they're going to want to know, if we work through the things that we've talked about, where's this objective come from? Does it have enough specificity about the asset universe, the extent to which we'll invest in different assets? Is it clear how you compare it versus anything else, or how you assess if it's done well or whether it's done poorly? So benchmarks, basically. Okay. How do I know what it's doing here? They're going to want to know that in detail. Is it appropriate? They're going to want to see model portfolios that match what it is that you'll say you're going to do. They want to know that that's been stress tested. So great, you've done a portfolio, it looks really brilliant, but what if there's another 2008, there's another military action taken globally, geopolitics affect markets? What happens in those circumstances? Does it still behave how you would expect it to. They're going to test it against the structure you've used. So if you're going the USITS route, then of course, does it fit within the borrowing powers, investment and borrowing powers, of a USITS structure? If it's going to be an alternative fund or a non-retail fund, then how are you distributing it? Who to? How do you make sure those are the people that are getting it, that it's not going to the wrong people?
Okay.
So it starts to really deep dive. So on the very surface, there's a lot of difficult decisions to make about the structure, how that fits with your capability from an investment perspective, and how you're going to sell it to the market. But then it goes a layer deeper when it gets that in front of a regulator.
So you've talked about the kind of in the investment piece there and benchmarks and model portfolios for the investment thesis. And I guess to put that just in simple terms, does that check out effectively? Does that check out with how that's been described? Is that something that a retail investor is going to understand if it's a retail focused fund? You've also talked about the distribution piece there, and we have this concept in regulation of a target market where we are determining from the outset who we think the fund is intended for, and then measuring whether actually that distribution is being measured, is being achieved in reality. I just wanted to ask you about fees, because this is we're creating a fund here from a commercial perspective. We need to make money on this, and so we need a fee that's going to allow us, of course, to cover costs and all of that, but actually make a profit. Kind of how does the FCA think about fees when they're assessing a new fund application?
There's two elements to it, isn't there? The one that is most talked about and understood now in the UK is value. So it's not about cost. So quite helpfully, when the value assessment regime came out, they didn't talk about just cost. This wasn't a cost regulating exercise. This was value regulating exercise. Sounds like the same thing, but actually it gives you a little bit more scope to say why the charges that you apply deliver value and aren't just a cost, and compare it to what everyone else is doing. But in reality, what you're trying to say is the value we think we deliver, so the performance outcome basically, is X, and the cost that we're charging is Y, and the reason that delivers value is because it's a reasonable difference between the two. And then that will also include some comparison with the market. It's a bit of an odd kind of contradiction here, where the regulators say, no, we're not regulating costs here. We're not saying they should all be below a certain amount or there's a benchmark or anything. But by the way, what else could you buy instead, and how does that look? So actually, it is a bit of a cost exercise. But then the other factor that they look at in particular, and something that we find comes up quite a lot with EU funds distributing into the UK and going through the OFR application process, is who are you paying money to? Not just direct from the fund, but from parties who receive money from the fund. So if a Manco receives a particular fee and they pay that on to someone else, they're going to want to know who it is you're paying it to and why are you paying it. Because what they don't want to see is, for example, advisors being paid commissions from the fund, because that starts to, they think, incentivize flows of client assets into those particular funds, like we had pre-RDR in the UK. Yeah,
and there's fees, costs and charges are really actually quite a challenging area. A lot of scrutiny. We had the retail distribution review, many years, so
14,
a decade and a half ago actually. So that was effectively removing that commission bias and the bundling of distribution fees. You mentioned a few other elements to that. There is I think a benchmarking there, if I can use that term, that the FCA will do in terms of how this fund sits against other funds. I've seen a lot of I think fund managers say, well, look, actually we're charging a higher fee because the performance is that good, and actually it's just a small extra fee because we're getting all of that additional performance, and that's something that I think the FCA will scrutinise. They won't necessarily say no to that, but there needs to be a justification for that. The other I think, piece that the FCA is focused on, and is indeed one of the criteria for value assessment, is economies of scale. And I think this expectation actually comes from the American industry historically, that as funds grow in size, the kind of marginal cost should shrink. So things like depository services or custody fees, should on a marginal basis reduce as the fund gets bigger, to try and at least leverage some of those economies of scale that I think the FCA is thinking should be passed on to retail investors. So it's a really, really complicated area, and certainly an area I've seen a lot of scrutiny from the FCA in. You're right that there isn't a sort of price regulation. The FCA hasn't said the number needs to be below 3 or 2 or 1 or whatever it may be for certain types of funds. But I think we do see increased justification where there are fees that are significantly higher than comparable funds.
Yeah, and I've had interactions in the past with the regulator who've made direct comparisons. So they've said, you've got a product here that's charging X basis points. We found this one that's significantly cheaper. Tell me why. So behind the scenes, there is direct comparison with cheaper products. And as you say, they're not necessarily saying you can't do that. You can't be more expensive. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, why are you more expensive? Justify that additional expense. And to pick up on that earlier point as well, about our performance is so much better than everybody else's, so of course we should be able to charge more. On the one hand, kind of philosophically, I kind of agree that if you are that good, then people are going to pay extra. They're going to pay a premium for a significantly better outcome. But taking off a kind of fund buyer looking for a good outcome hat for a minute and putting on a regulatory hat for a second, actually what a higher fee does is guarantee it will be harder for you to repeat that outperformance in the future, because your charges are going to erode your future performance more than the cheaper funds charges are going to erode performance. So it's a difficult argument to make, really. And
just to bring this back to our earlier discussion about distributing EU funds in the UK, one of the differences that we highlighted earlier was that EU UCITS that are being distributed in the UK under the overseas funds regime, they don't have to produce a value assessment. So they don't have to produce the report. We actually see some managers have done that. And there's also been some expectation from some of the distributors that's done, but that's not a regulatory requirement in the way that it is for UK UCITS. But actually, from a fees point of view and a costs and charges point of view, although we have different concepts here, we have the UK having its value concept that the FCA has introduced, and then the EU with its undue costs constraint for UCITS. Actually, I think what we're saying then is, if we have an EU UCITS that wants to be sold in the UK, that's going to be viewed through almost a value lens by the FCA when they're thinking about recognising that fund under the overseas funds regime. So, I mean, does that mean that we're actually seeing a bit of convergence there in the way regulators are thinking about that? And when we're thinking, actually, we're going to launch this EU UCITS fund and the UK is going to be one of the markets that we're targeting, do we need to do that fee comparison, the cost and charges comparison with kind of the UK market as well as the EU market?
Yeah. I think the UK market has often been the kind of gold standard for regulation. That doesn't mean I'm saying it's better or worse, but in terms of its impact and the level of detail and how much effort they go to, that's kind of what it's been. And then Europe generally will take some of that, so undue cost versus value assessment, start to follow it and then build on that. It's like they want to see how it pans out in the UK before they go all that way over here. But if you are looking at doing EU UCITS distributed into the UK versus UK only, then I would say that the EU UCITS into the UK, it's a good exercise to maybe go through the fuller cold version of a full value assessment to see how you would look and where you would land and how that feels. If you pass muster on that and you're comfortable internally, then you're going to have the EU market pretty well dealt with anyway, because of that extra layer of scrutiny that exists in in the UK market. However, if you do that and you don't like what you see, or there are things that you want to pay out of a fund that you can't if you come to the UK, then that's probably going to drive your decision a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the Cole rules are the the FCA's rules where the value assessment criteria kind of set out that you need to think about. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of kind of elements we've talked about here in terms of the regulatory puzzle. I think we focused a lot on the investment piece, so what the fund is investing in, the distribution piece, so who we are targeting, both in terms of the investor type, or we're thinking about mass market retail versus sophisticated retail or professional and like, what's our target market there? And we talked about costs and charges and fees. Is there anything else that we've kind of missed that the FCA or other regulators look at when they're assessing fund applications?
Those are like the key bits. So when we talk about designing a fund and where am I going to go with this and etc., those are the main bits that are going to cause you the biggest headaches, that need the most attention to them, because that's basically affecting your fundamentals. What do I invest in?
Yep.
Who do I sell it to, and where are they? There's not really three bigger things than that. But the one thing that I think we perhaps haven't talked about that firms need to think about is the firms themselves.
Yes.
So are you competent? Who is doing the portfolio management? Where are they based? Who are they regulated by? Because it's not necessarily a given that a portfolio manager in a UK UCITS has to be UK authorised. There are different options for that. Same with EU UCITS.
Yeah.
But who is doing that? Who is their regulator? Are they up to standard? Would the FCA be happy with that? Who's providing the various other services in respect of that, or permissions if they got? Who are the people behind the scenes? How much time is being spent? That I think is the bit that will be dug into that we've not touched on.
Yeah, okay. And to put some flesh around that, I think we're talking about a few elements there. We're talking about the management company, so we can think about that either as the UCITS management company in an EU UCITS context, or the alternative investment fund manager. We call that the authorised corporate director, the ACD, for example, in the UK. All effectively the same, concept. It is the entity that's regulated, that is performing the core, marketing, administration, and portfolio management and risk management sort of pieces of that. So there's the considerations, all as you were describing, around the fitness and propriety of the senior management team, the board, the organisation of that. We then have to think about service providers as well. You've mentioned the portfolio manager being, a critical one if we have a third-party portfolio manager that we're delegating to. But I guess we should also talk about the depository and the administrator, the transfer agent there, the valuer if there is one. And then we need to think about, all of the sort of the way in which those structures fit together. Is there delegation across border? And I think this is something we see regulators like the Central Bank of Ireland or the CSSF in the EU, the FCA. It's not just a kind of substance question. Do you have people on the ground doing certain things? It's how all of those things kind of fit together. So that's a whole kind of other piece. We talked a lot about the product, the regulatory puzzle. I guess we could spend another 30 minutes talking about the kind of regulatory puzzle on the on the actual management company, the ACD.
And I think as you were talking there, I recognise the fact that there probably is another 30 minutes, and that we should spend 30 minutes talking about it in a different podcast, because this is not the time to extend it. But you're right. There's a whole bunch of other parties. We kind of talk like we are speaking on behalf of or to the portfolio manager primarily, because they tend to also be the distributor. So they're the ones with the idea. They're the ones with the customer base, or that are going to go out there and find the customers. They're the ones who are then going out to the different providers. Who's going to be my Manco or my ACD, and how am I going to structure this thing that I want to take to markets. But that's a big one, and probably a more complicated question than we can deal with in the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great.
Super. Okay, good. Thank you, Giles.
Thank you very much.